Welcome, Natasha. Thank you for sharing your work, agreeing to share your work with us. I'll just read out the small bio that you have sent. Dr. Natasha Isa Shivji is the director of the Institute for Research in Intellectual Histories of Africa in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge Political Science and African Studies Department. She completed her PhD at New York University in the History Department and her MA at McGill University, Montreal. She has previously lectured at the University of Dar es Salaam and University of Dodoma in Tanzania. Welcome, Natasha, whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you very much. I am very happy to be able to share my work in this space. So the way I want to format today's seminar is essentially on the basis of themes that I would hope we can discuss further in the discussion time. So I'm throwing out some very large ideas with the concrete example of the Mombasa Republican Council in Kenya. And I hope this format works out because I'm quite interested in the feedback I can receive on this particular, some of the theoretical aspects of it more so than the concrete. So the assumed autonomous character of the nation is rooted in an expression of a past based on a discourse grounded on an imagined shared history that progresses towards an infinite future. It is simultaneously born of a past with a specific origin and a future rooted in the imagined progress of the present moment. Despite, or perhaps because of, the contradictory nature of nationalism as an ideological formation, the discourse of the nation is of import in the anti-colonial movements as it uses the fractures in the colonial system to open doors to a pre-colonial past, an assumed shared history of the colonial subjects that was produced under a different logic to the colonial present. However, such a project could not remain at the level of discourse and ultimately had political agendas rooted in anti-colonialism and autonomy of the nation, often a political ambition articulated towards a sovereign state. Irredentist claims became part of the post-colonial nation-state building project, creating layers of political discourse that were often irreconcilable. Yet, the nation, as an ideological concept that claims a certain unity through its pre-colonial past, provides the grounds upon which the complexities of the pre-colonial histories emerge. Nonetheless, nationalist histories do not do the work of situating the norms and idioms of pre-colonial histories in their historical time. Rather, these pasts become encapsulated by the totality produced by a nationalist discourse in a modernist period. As Michael Tossing so aptly writes, language, in this case the discourses and idioms of the nation, depends on this lingering on as an idea tracing an outline around a once solid breathing form, troubling the body's own bodiness, circling endlessly now and again, pausing for breath, words and things, drifting apart, coming together. I contend that situating these pasts within their historical moment is crucial in understanding and analyzing the contradictions that unfold in Mombasa in Kenya. Due to the nature of the colonial state's presence in this region, pre-colonial structures and relations weren't dissolved entirely into the machinations of the colonial administration. Neither did they exist in historical continuity outside of it. They were indeed subsumed to a certain extent, but maintained their skeletal form in order to serve capitalist production in the periphery. The moment of political crisis, that is, a crisis in the nation, expressed in the form of secessionist demands, questions the premise of the existing nation while claiming a new and more coherent nation in place of the nation state. The moment of political crisis further exposes the incoherence of the assumed logic of capital and the modern state. The once solid, breathing form contained by the language of nationalism awakes, perhaps in a dismembered form, to lay its claim to a moment of history. This does not necessarily imply an inevitable progress towards a triumph of the past. Non-capitalist forms over the modern capitalist social relations. In fact, this crisis, this political crisis against the nation state in particular, may serve to reproduce exploitative capitalist social relations. Mombasa is deeply rooted in networks of Islamic intellectual exchange and established caravan and oceanic trading networks, as well as a language of dependency and clientage existing outside of capitalist social relations. After all, capitalism does not have a coherent nature. While it feeds on the non-capitalist forces, it cannot fully engulf them. In the process of resisting the colonial as well as the post-colonial state, these secessionist movements erase historical contestation and complexity to produce singular histories of the people. Assuming a coherence of capitalist structure leaves little room to decipher the forms of resistance and the facets of exploitation that erupt from these unresolved contestations. I think of secession not as a final instance or even a demand that is cohesive, but rather as a process that revealed more than it resolved. This approach helps us to move away from the focus on results of political models. For instance, I avoid questions such as, why did secessionism fail, or even why did secessionism occur? This, I propose, produces a model that assumes secessionist movements have a beginning and an end with a coherence that is present throughout. Indeed, can the cultural autonomy of a people be defined or maintained within structures of dominance? Instead, I view secession as useful insofar as it uses the idioms of a normative category, nationalism, to resist it and reveals pre-capitalist social relations subsumed under capitalism. Through a discussion of Waqf endowments, which I will elaborate shortly, I move away from the epoch debate that assumes distinct breaks from the 16th century onwards. Rather, the transformations that took place were gradual, which I argue explains the persistence of fragments of pre-colonial formations during the colonial period. These fragmented and reconfigured pre-colonial formations existed within colonial settings, but also formed their own mechanisms of exploitation outside the colonial administration. Mombasa was never fully integrated within colonial circuits of production. In fact, the colonial administrators heavily relied on a local land-owning class to aid in administering the land by maintaining pre-colonial systems of exploitation and property relations that were rooted in the Indian Ocean world networks of exchange. Again, I will elaborate this shortly. After the imposition of European rule, this landed class were largely cut off from the once vibrant trading and intellectual networks that produced systems of authority. Consequently, the landed elite resorted to the colonial state as a means to accumulate this lost authority. The institution of Waqf, which are essentially inalienable religious endowments, became central to the landed elite's attempt to maintain its authority. The subsequent history of Waqf unfolded as a contested terrain, where relations of exploitation between a local landed elite and a working landless people were sustained in a shared grievance against the state. The language of nationalism and autonomy briefly allied the interests of an educated proprietor class seeking political representation within the state and a working people. For both the colonial and post-colonial state, Waqf land was the illegible, ungovernable space of the coast, which became the illicit site for accumulation by the state, as lands protected by customary law were grabbed by the ruling elite and commodified. This serves as a brief introduction into some of the things I would like to elaborate on in the remaining time that I have. Essentially, the Mombasa Republican Council was formed in 1999 in Mombasa, Kenya. This was not the first time that there was a political organization on the coast that relied on questions of autonomy and secessionist demands in order to become legible, as I argue, to the state. This started in During 1960 to 1963, during the Lancaster Conference, several claims were made through what was called Majimbo, which essentially translates into regionalism, where Mombasa, amongst many other parts of Kenya and East Africa in general, claimed a certain form of autonomy from the central Kenyan state. And that autonomy took on the form of regionalism, and they were fighting for a federal government. In 1999, these claims for autonomy took on a very distinct discourse of secession, particularly through the Mombasa Republican Council. The Mombasa Republican Council was formed in 1999 in response, I argue, to a contestation over the Diani complex. The Diani complex was a very fertile, beautiful tract of land that extended throughout the coast. It was grabbed by the state and converted into a tourist site, and various political elite built mansions and used the land for their own purposes. As many have argued, in the case of the Global South, particularly in the context of Africa, the state does act as a site of accumulation. And so it wasn't a surprise that it was the political elite that were grabbing this land. The crisis occurred when not only were people dispossessed of this land, but much of this land was actually Waqf land. Now, this is very important in the discourse of the MRC, because Waqf land has been constituted as an Islamic institution, of course, from the beginning of Islam. But in the case of East Africa, it really took on a role of giving legitimacy to an economic and political elite in the 13th and 14th century, when you had migrations across the Indian Ocean. For instance, the Hadramis, who came in different waves from the 13th century on the coast of East Africa, particularly in Mombasa and Zanzibar, relied heavily on the institution of Waqf in order to create some kind of political, intellectual and political legitimacy on the coast as foreigners to the coast. This institution was, while Waqf can take on various forms, including endowing libraries, endowing educational institutions, building mosques, etc. In the East African coast, it largely took on the form of endowing tracts of land, hence creating, and not to be reductionist, but creating what looked like patron-client relationships, where the movement of peoples into this terrain and the building of city-states along the East African coast relied heavily on the legitimacy that they were able to garner by creating patron-client relationships through the endowed land, through endowing large tracts of land in which various groups that existed in these spaces could rely on, and they could also be engulfed into the ideological systems essentially under the umbrella of Islam. So this is a brief history of what Waqf represented in this particular moment. And Waqf wasn't simply a pre-capitalist economic form of entrenching certain social relations of exploitation through patron-client relations and mercantile relations, but it also provided a space in which exchange of intellectual thought and exchange of ideas, exchange of commodities could take place. For instance, the Hadramis who settled in Mombasa, many of them were scholars, many of them were able to, the incomes that came out of the endowed land, whether it was incomes generated through donations and charity, or incomes generated through the rent, the tributes that were paid by the squatters who were living off of this land, were sent back to Hadramaut in order to sustain educational institutions in Hadramaut. Similarly, in Turkey, the establishment of the Waqf Commission during the colonial period in the early 20th century, there's a lot of material that's referencing back to East Africa, that how will this affect the kind of monies that are moving across the Indian Ocean to East Africa? And of course, the colonial administration worried greatly about the exchange of commodities, monies, and ideas across the Indian Ocean, across the Red Sea, that was essentially happening through these institutions of Waqf. While they couldn't completely dismantle Waqf because they relied heavily on the social and economic relations that it created, they had to find a way of codifying it and containing it so that these movements were not so easily made. During the colonial period, the relationships that are forged through these Waqf endowments are not broken, like many cases on the African continent and in the global south, in the colonized, in the formerly colonized world. The pre-existing social relations are subsumed into capitalist relations. The subsumption of labor, the real subsumption at the initial stages, does not take place by simply creating wage workers instantaneously, but rather it relies on these pre-existing formulations. And this is a well-known history. What I am trying to posit is that that space between the real subsumption of labor through these Waqf endowments and the kind of taking advantage of the landed elite's relationship to the exploitative relationship it had to those who relied on these lands. While this occurs and it creates new forms of exploitation that can be further exploited by capitalist social relations under the colonial system, it is an uneven development towards formal subsumption. That is, the incomes that are garnered from these patron-client relationships that the colonial administrators heavily relied on are not necessarily reinvested into technology, etc., in order to create this trajectory towards a fully developed capitalist system. Rather, there's an uneven development towards that process, if that process occurs at all. It is within this uneven development, within this terrain of contradictions and class struggle, where the MRC become a very interesting study into looking at what it reveals about the contradictions on a political level during this moment. Because I think that the tendency tends to be, at least in how we understand political movements on the continent, particularly secessionist movements, either we take on the discourse of the nation state, which is that the problematic here is colonialism that broke down ethnicities and communities, etc. And so these are the problematics that arise after borders were created and people were left out of the building of the nation state. It is a modern problem. It is a problem of colonialism and borders. And so the response of these groups of people that claim autonomy from the central state is essentially a response that is coming from alternative histories that exist outside of the state, histories that are claiming a better unity of the nation that cannot be subsumed by the nation state, or which existed on colonial boundaries. The economic explanation tends to be, again, quite reductionist in a similar fashion, arguing that secessionist movements are nothing short of incoherent demands of people who are aggrieved, allying their interests with the exploiting class. In the case of the MRC, this has been very much the case, because the MRC's claim to secession has often been allied with the land-owning class, the land-owning elite in Mombasa. Now, the land-owning elite, I should perhaps elaborate, in Mombasa, come from a long line of the Omanis who had come into the coast in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries and built various city-states along Lamu, Pate, Kilwa, etc., along the East African coast. In the case of Mombasa, particularly the Mazrui, had large tracts of land which they were able to endow as waqf. This not only acted in order to, as I mentioned earlier, to produce a sense of legitimacy to a group of people that were considered migrants. I don't want to use the term foreigners because that doesn't really apply to the context of the kind of networks and exchanges that were happening across the Indian Ocean, but were considered migrants from outside. In addition to creating legitimacy, they were also able to position themselves as an intellectual class, as a social class that had the credibility to produce thought and ideas that were moving across the Indian Ocean, and of course to garner followers. Islam was a crucial umbrella, and Talal Assad's idea of the discursive in Islam is essential in this, in that Islamic institutions were both reproducing and being produced in this system. With time, and of course, the whole slave owning aspect is also a part of it, but I don't really want to engage with that part of how they accumulated wealth through that trajectory. But with the creation of this legitimacy and essentially acting as patrons to an extent where, for example, the Witu Sultanate that was formed in the mid-19th century in the hinterland of Lamu was actually an abode for runaway slaves from Zanzibar, and what was created by a particular ethnic group, which were the Nabudai of the Omanis, particularly the Mazrui Omanis. And so this kind of landscape, this kind of social landscape that exists in the pre-colonial period is utilized, it is subsumed to a certain extent during the colonial period, but maintaining in many ways the role and relationship that the land-owning elite in the form of the Mazrui had in Mombasa. And that exploitative relationship that they have to the followers now turned squatters on these Waqf endowments is maintained only insofar as to assist in the colonial administration. They act as intermediaries. So the old story of how the elite become intermediaries in the colonial system is very much the case in this particular instance, but the specificity of how this is done is what produces the kind of discourse, the political discourse that ensues. And so this land-owning elite that is moving through the colonial system with very many privileges. For example, the Mazrui Land Act was created by the British in Mombasa in order to protect Mazrui lands. And many exceptions were made in terms of resolving disputes where they were outside the purview of the colonial jurisdiction. And much of the land that was under the Mazrui Land Act was converted to Waqf by the land-owning elite during this period in order to further protect it and to maintain their legitimacy outside the colonial state. At independence, much of this changes due to the kind of regionalist claims that were made during the Lancaster Conference negotiations. The Mazrui land-owning elite find they have no role to play in the state any longer. The newly established Kenyan state after independence has excluded much of the economic elite on the coast, much of the Somali economic elite at the north, and maintained a very kind of centralized Kenyan state that does not consider these regions economically part and parcel of the state. And the state, again, much has been written on this, acted as the site of accumulation. And so for obvious reasons, the Mazrui landed elite on the coast want a part of the state. And so it is not strange that when the MRC, a landless people who have been evicted of their lands, who've been completely dispossessed of their lands, in some cases they were literally burnt off their land, in their claims to their secession and autonomy are joined by the Mazrui landed elite, who are also now claiming secessionism and autonomy, much like the MRC. In this particular moment of crisis where the MRC is claiming secession based on the social ideas that they do not belong to the Christian Kenyan state, that the coast is largely Muslim, they belong to a longer history of coastal relations, they belong to a larger history of the Indian Ocean network, and so secession would make sense because the nation can be re-understood, reconstituted in accordance with this long historical narrative. At the same time, the landed elite are taking advantage of what the MRC are arguing by arguing very similarly that there is no sense of belonging to the Kenyan state, but at once vying for positions within the state. So my argument is that the land-owning elite essentially are creating a political constituency through the MRC in order to negotiate spaces within the state, while the MRC actually have very different interests from the Mazrui landed elite. And it's important to note that the Mazrui landed elite never took part in the actual organizing of the MRC, never claimed to be members of the MRC. And the state did crack down on the MRC by using language of anti-terrorism, Islamic agitation, external influence from terrorist organizations, etc. It was the farmers, it was the fisher people, it was those who depended on these Waqf lands, that were dispossessed of these Waqf lands, that immediately disappear and are tortured and are killed and imprisoned. It is not the landed elite who actually were able to create political constituencies significant enough to garner representation in the state. And so there are very divergent economic interests on the question of land and who is benefiting from the land and who is exploiting the land at play. But the political language that it takes on through that of secessionism is one that almost seems to unify these interests in the discourse of a longer history in a discourse of a longer historical narrative that expands centuries, that moves back and forth from the 16th and 13th centuries to the current period. The idea that the Waqf institution, the institution of Waqf, was an Islamic institution that was sacred to the religion, to the belief, is very much used during this period, that the state is intervening in a sacred institution. It is intervening in endowments that technically are supposed to belong to God. That's strange phraseology. But according to the religious practice, all this, the land that is endowed as waqf belongs only to God. On earth, it only has trustees. And the trustees, of course, happen to be those who endowed it, who belong to the Mazrui landed elite. But using and depending on the Mazrui landed elite as their patrons and depending on them as the only source of survival, essentially, the only way that they're able to subsidize their existence through these waqf endowments is what momentarily brings these interests together. Hi, am I still?
Yeah, I think there was a Zoom bombing or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so thinking of the MRC as a representation of economic interests of an oppressed group of people who are exploited by a landed elite and the state, which is the site of accumulation, or thinking of the MRC as representative of a pre-capitalist past that exists in linearity as an alternative to the nation state in the modern period. Neither one actually explains how the MRC comes to unfold. In initial discourses with the MRC, there's absolutely no hint that this is a landless people's movement. There are no gestures made towards grievances around the land. It is simply a movement, they argue, that is trying to protect, that is trying to re-establish a historical past that belonged to a particular people, that formed a unity outside the Christian nation state, and that could further consolidate the interests of a particular group of people, in this case, Muslims of the coast, against the Christian nation state. This discourse is weaponized by both sides, and it is also used by the state in order to disarm the MRC. It is used by the landed elite in order to co-opt them into kind of state politics by using them as a constituency and maintaining exploitative relations on the land. It is used by the state by essentially disintegrating the MRC through all these discourses of anti-terrorism, etc. And the MRC do not express their grievances in any other way but through this kind of political language in order to gain political legitimacy to the state. For instance, there was one of the factors that completely dismissed the MRC, an anecdote that is often used in discussing the MRC, was that they wrote a letter in the early 2000s to the Queen of England, claiming that they had a different relationship to the colonial state than did the hinterland of Kenya. The colonial state they were a protectorate of the colonial state. They were a protectorate of the colonial state. I think there's something going on. We might need to block some people here. In the
Can you
chat
just tell
section.
the chat?
We were a protectorate of the colonial state. And as a protectorate of the colonial state, we had a very different relationship to the colonial state. So it only makes sense that independence, we should have had a separate trajectory. from the Kenyan state. And of course, this argument makes very little sense because for all intents and purposes, Mombasa was administered as a colony, even though it was through negotiations with the Sultanate of Zanzibar, etc. But it was administered as a colony. It was administered as part of Kenya. But in order to make their grievances legible politically to the state, in order to make their grievances legible to the Kenyan nation state, they use the discourses of documents and the written, of dissecting written documents in order to make themselves legible. Because the idea that these Waqf endowments are sacred lands upon which they rely on and depend on in a system that has only partially subsumed them into capitalist social relations and essentially rely on these relationships for survival is not one that can be articulated politically. It is an economic articulation that happens through a deep understanding of how processes of subsumption took place in this particular region. There is very little understanding of this. The discourse of Waqf endowments, the migration processes of the Hadramis, the Mazrui Omanis who came to the coast, the kind of dependency and discursivity of Islam and Islamic networks of exchange, mobility, and migration. All these discourses belong heavily to Islamic studies and Islam in Africa. And they are very rarely marshaled in order to understand what is happening in terms of pre-capitalist forms of social relations and how these are subsumed into capital. The minute you go into the discourses of capital and how capital actually used these patron-client relationships, you immediately run the risk of economic reductionism by arguing that these were simply exploitative social relationships, very neatly subsumed into capitalist social relations. And of course, the outcome was very clear. You have the creation of wage laborers who may look like they use fragments of pre-colonial past, but actually are now fully subsumed into capitalist social relations. Both of these explanations do very little to explain the political discourse that secessionist movements take, particularly the MRC, using discourses of Islam, using discourses of Indian Ocean networks of exchange, and similarly relying heavily on land on which they're exploited, both through the state, but also through the landed owning elite that they seem to have social relations with that predate pre-capitalist relations. Therefore, I would like to end by saying that it is important not to reduce the manifestations of struggle in this uneven development that takes place between the process of real subsumption to formal subsumption, if we are to understand the trajectory in that way. But that space of uneven development, that space of uneven subsumption in between, is exactly where we see the format in which struggles take place, the formulation of struggles. And these struggles might not take on the forms we imagine them to take on. That is through class struggles of wage workers fighting against the state or factory owners, etc., or even in terms of the peasants, an uprising of the peasants. They may take on very different forms. And we need to pay attention to these forms, both intellectually, analytically, and also historically, how they are developed. The MRC has been dismissed entirely as being taken seriously as a political organization. They've been dismissed by conservative groups, statist groups, as being simply an externally influenced Islamist group. They've been dismissed by leftists as being very confused and politically incoherent. But what they are expressing, the language that they are choosing to use, I think gives us glimpses into a much longer history that may be marshaled, the memory of which may be marshaled precisely because capitalism relied on the subsumption of these pre-capitalist social relations. And these pre-capitalist social relations were not simply economic social relations. They were constituted ideologically, they were constituted intellectually and socially, and produced social landscapes and memories that continue to exist alongside the skeletons of them. So if the Waqf institution is understood as an economically exploitative relationship and a patron-client relationship of merchants against peasants, then we fail to understand the extent to which the Waqf institutions actually produce an ideology and intellectual landscape through exchange, through educational system, through support of educational institutions back and forth across the Indian Ocean, etc. And how these were not simply romanticized fragments of memories that linger on under capitalism that the oppressed woefully look at, but rather constitute the discourse that they use in resisting the nation state, and not only ideologically resisting the nation state, but in fact critiquing the nation state as the site of accumulation, revealing it as the site of accumulation by showing how the intermediaries vie for the state in order to accumulate. I hope that wasn't too convoluted. I really wanted to bring in much of this material for discussion and questions and further elaboration in the discussion period, because it's something I'm working on in my book right now. So I really love all the input I can get at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And let me apologize. I think there is a Zoom attack. There's something weird happening. I'm getting all of these strange requests to come into the room, which I don't recognize at all, and they look really suspicious. So just be wary of that, everyone. I think there is something really strange happening, because I don't know how that happened. I'm actually, as I speak, I'm removing people from the waiting room. But thank you for such a wonderful, considered and interesting paper. What we'll do is we have a good 20 minutes. So I'll open it up to the floor, and as you all know, you can just switch on your camera or use the hand tool and ask a question or comment. The floor is open. Yes, Shamil, please go ahead.
Hi. Thank you, Natasha. Very interesting, fascinating stuff. I came in slightly late, so you may have already mentioned some of this contextual detail. I'm just wondering about the size, the extent of this land. Number one, if you just can give me an idea, I'm trying to visualize. So it's mainly focused on Mombasa. Is that correct? I just fix that, yeah. And then I'm just thinking of the traces, the documentary evidence for the Waqf. And there are two kinds of Waqf. You have family Waqf, and then you have the religious Waqf. A family Waqf can be transferred. It's transferable. It can be terminated, in my understanding of the law. Whereas the other kind of Waqf, that is the Waqf which belongs to God, like a mosque or a madrasa or something. But there's other kinds of endowments that can be exchanged. So I'm just wondering if that kind of distinction is present there, or if they try to cover themselves by not introducing the family endowment category and making it all religious. So that's my first question. Yeah, it's just clarification.
Yeah, in the case of Mombasa, the religious waqfs were actually used to endow lands for the purposes of building mosques and madrasas. But in many cases, these mosques and madrasas were not built. And in many cases, you had those who relied on the land but were excluded from it, acting as squatters on the land. And so it was not transferable. In some cases, there are many documents available that date to the mid-19th century that I've been able to access from the Mombasa archives, which are part of the Kenya National Archives, that show evidence of family waqfs. And from the interviews of present, those who are still protecting those family waqfs and those who are guarantors of these family waqfs, one of the main crises has been how to commodify these waqfs. And they're facing great contestation, not only from family members who want to maintain these family waqfs, because even those family waqfs, for instance, I was interviewing, and interestingly, of course, many of the guarantors of these family waqfs are women, because it was male counterparts who made these waqfs in order to protect the women in the family and to make sure that they were guaranteed to have some tracts of land. And many of them have these endowments that are family waqfs that have been in the family since the mid-19th century. They were created in the mid-19th century, but are completely abandoned and are on the outskirts of Mombasa city. And often squatters live on that land as well, relying on that land. So you have, and this was the instance in so many cases where you have rundown houses in large tracts of land that are considered family waqfs, but you have squatters living off of this land, living in the houses, producing on this land, of course, small production, and relying on it. In an attempt to remove these peoples from the land, there was resistance from the male members of these families, particularly in these two families I interviewed, because they were vying for political positions and relied heavily on their charitable kind of disposition in the community. So even where these family waqfs existed in the case of Mombasa, with the kind of crisis of the MRC, there were many instances that you could see where they weren't so easily removed from their waqf status, even when the actual guarantor wanted to remove them from their waqf status, because there was more to be gained from it. Because they were owned by the family as a whole and they couldn't be broken down, a single family member could not decide that this waqf can be transferred into a different kind of, can be codified in a different way. They had to get the consent of the entire family, and very often the entire family did not give that consent because of these political ambitions during this particular period. And that's something I write about a bit more in order to discuss the political implications on waqf endowments and the distinction that even with the family waqfs, they ended up acting very much like the religious waqfs in the way that they, in the kind of social, in their socialization, in their social role. And this was maintained not because of the charitable and good-heartedness of particular family members, but because they had something to gain politically from ensuring that they had this political constituency supporting them. And so that was, in many cases, I found this to be, of course, not all. In some cases, not only were the family waqfs transferred, but they were transferred forcefully and in collaboration with the guarantors. In some instances of family waqfs, you found that overnight there was a deed for the land, and suddenly it was no longer under Waqf administration, under the Waqf administration. Of course, these were constructed, there was a lot of theft involved by the political elite. And so that was also occurring simultaneously. But even in the cases where there was an obvious claim that some family members wanted to change the status of the Waqf, they did not, in many instances, get collaboration of all the family members. And I think this crisis in itself is quite interesting and revealing of what was going on in that political moment.
Just one small question, if I may.
Yes, please go ahead.
Just one small. So what, I mean, British lawmaking, colonial lawmaking, can you just say something whether they try to rewrite the law on Waqf when they wanted to take some of the land? Or I may have missed something in your talk, but there's, you know, a British legal engagement. I know it's very deep in terms of trying to rework Islamic law. And I can't recall if they did anything on endowments, but it's a pretty standard category within Islamic law. So I don't know if you came across anything.
The Waqf Commissioners Act was created in the late 19th century. Waqf Commissioners Act. This was created in Zanzibar, it was created in Mombasa, and it was based on what was created in India.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
simultaneously to what they were doing in India, and recently I saw some very interesting archival documents from Turkey.
Yeah.
While they were also creating the Waqf Commissioners Act in Turkey, and there were all these negotiations happening as to how monies would flow from Cyprus into the administration of Turkey under the king and so on, they are making a lot of references to what they're doing in East Africa at the same time, and how they're creating the Waqf Commissioners Act in East Africa. The Waqf Commissioners Act changed some elements insofar as you actually had to produce a written document. So there are several documents that were written in Arabic that were in Kiswahili, but using the Arabic text, several documents that stipulate how this waqf is created, for what purposes it is created, whether it's family or religious, who will be the guarantor, and how the incomes from it will move. In one instance, for example, there's a tract of land that was created as a family waqf, and the incomes that were derived from it were moving from Mombasa to Zanzibar. They were moving directly from Mombasa to Zanzibar because there was a sister in Zanzibar who was also benefiting from this waqf. With the creation of the Waqf Commissioners Acts, and with essentially coercing these families to write down exactly the stipulations of the waqf and who were the guarantors, who were the administrators, and how they were moving, the sister is no longer able to benefit because she belongs to a different jurisdiction. She's no longer able to benefit from this waqf. So there were things like that that kind of tried to contain the movement of incomes of the waqfs. In a larger example, during the British interest in Iraq in the 1920s, the movement of incomes was completely banned across the Indian Ocean from even the religious waqfs. And those incomes were very much administered according to Mombasa and Zanzibar very distinctly. They were banned from moving across the ocean. So there are various instances in how the Waqf Commissioners Act served to, and I think the largest impact it had on how the Waqf institution was perpetuated was by containing it, and containing the movement of any kind of incomes, any kind of resources that the Waqf was producing, whether it was through donations or whether it was through rent or et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamil. Thanks, Natasha, for that detailed answer. We have two other questions. There's one in Alirio. Do you want to just ask the question in person, if that, or do you? I don't know how. Alirio has put up a question in the chat. Maybe you would like to respond to it, and then there is Nyambura. You want to ask a question? Sorry, Natasha, can you see the chat? The question in the chat.
Yeah, I'll read it out aloud.
Yes.
I have to say I was taken aback by your declining to reflect on the relationship between slavery and the patronage relations at play, because this and embedded claims to and against Africanity, Arabness, seems essential to the matter across its periods, and seems to me much more essential than the debates that seem to be frustrating you with the liturgical Marxists. So I'm going to ask if you could expand on the relationship between the patronage, kin, political, economic, religious networks, and that history. Sorry to type my question. Okay, it's not that I'm declining to discuss the question of slavery and the kind of clientage that was formed through it. Of course, it's historical, it's an essential form to how these patron-client relationships were formed and the exploitative nature of them. The only reason I am not engaging with it in this particular talk is because I do not think that it necessarily sheds light as to how the way the political language is formulated with the MRC. Because if the point is to bring in the question of slavery in order to address the Arabness, in order to address the foreignness of a particular group of people who came in as Arab slave traders and enslaved Africans, and to address it along those terms is to bring it forward to the particular moment where it is now Africans fighting against these ex-Arab slave owners, then that makes very little sense in the case of Mombasa, because it is not the case at all. The so-called Arab slave owners are actually part and parcel of these political movements. They're actually working hand in hand, very superficially, of course, with members of the MRC. So the relationship of slavery and the exploitative nature of slavery very much deserves attention, and it has been given ample attention. There's several works we can read on it, but to kind of pull it and to drag it into trying to describe what kind of grievances there are against the nation state and what kind of grievances there, like what kind of, how it is embedded into capitalist social relations, I think stretches the argument too far. And often the idea of Arab slavery is used in order to make the argument that colonialism wasn't the only form of exploitation. Arabs enslaved Africans before it, and they too were exploitative, et cetera, and so the kind of discourse that we have today is Africans looking for their true independence against ex-Arab slave owners. But I think that the entanglement, primarily because of the networks of Islam, primarily because of the networks of migration and mobility, and the kind of shifts that were happening throughout the period with the development of city-states, I think it's very distinct and deserves an analysis of its own, rather than trying to squeeze it into the discourse of exploitative capitalist social relations and how they manifest themselves in terms of political crisis and political discourse. That's the only reason I didn't engage with it fully, and I simply clumped it up into patron-client exploitative relationships in the pre-capitalist period.
Thanks, Natasha. I think the Alirio has a short follow-up comment which you can have a look at, but in the meantime, let's take Nyambura's question. If you can go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Natasha, for the beautiful presentation. I'm Kenyan, and a lot of the context that you've given has just been fantastic. So I have a question, and perhaps it will sort of like, not to take you away from Mombasa itself, but thinking about the land question, not just in Kenya, but the land question in the coast region itself. So not just Mombasa. When you think about the coastal region, Kilifi, Kwale, Lamu, Taita Taveta, Tana River County, spaces and places in the country that have been plagued with, serious, for example, political violence, especially during the 1992 elections, 97 and 2007. So one of the things I'm trying to think with is, what are the possibilities of solidarity, for example, between the Mombasa Republican Council, but then thinking about claims around land and the squatter issue as it's known within the coastal region. So maybe it would be nice to hear a little bit of what are the possibilities of solidarity, but also how do we expound on the question? Because I don't think that thinking about the land question in the coast region can just be contained within, for example, Mombasa, because it is a region with very, very particular land questions in Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyambura, for the question.
Thanks. The possibilities of solidarity, I'm not sure how to answer this question without, I do not know what possibilities of solidarity there are, and I do not claim to, personally, I do not think that the political claims that the MRC makes are viable. I do not think secessionism is the solution to this particular crisis. I do not think that at this particular moment, autonomy and secessionism of the coast can lead to anything given the kind of global context. So the idea of solidarity and developing the secessionist claims would almost, if I answer that, would almost ally me with those interests. I think it is a very interesting movement. I think it reveals a lot, and I think as those who are interested in social and political movements, we must take seriously how those formulations take place on the ground and organically, even if we do not agree with them. And this is the organic way in which it is taking place. This is how the landless people movement is constructing itself. It's constructing itself as a political organization trying to claim secessionism from the state. It is constructing with these irredentist claims. It is speaking of Waqf endowments and protecting Waqf endowments. And so these are claims I'm trying to analyze historically and understand them in this particular conjuncture. Now, in terms of how they have organized themselves with various claims across the coast, to my knowledge, in the few years I've been thinking through this and working in Mombasa, there have been no claims to outright solidarity. I mean, I think that would be a very dangerous move on their part if they were to claim. But we know in Zanzibar, there have been similar claims to autonomy. There isn't a single political organization such as the MRC, but there are several hints and several kind of threats that Zanzibar wants autonomy from Tanzania because of the undemocratic nature in which it was united with mainland Tanganyika, et cetera, and the grievances, which are very similar, in fact, to the people of Mombasa. In Lamu, especially with the LAPSAT project that came up recently, well, that started a few years back, but has come to fruition in the last couple of years. And the kind of dispossession of land, and in some instances, the few interviews I did with some people organizing against the LAPSAT project, they were also complaining about Waqf and making references to MRC and how they had organized. The MRC has been quiet for a couple of years recently, but there were references to the memory of the MRC and how they were organizing around Waqf endowments and how they were organizing against the state and how the state was basically a perpetrator on these lands. So there are hints here and there about cross-referencing the movements along the coast, which would obviously be the case because they share a very similar history and there are similar elements at stake. But in terms of an organized solidarity, I don't think there is one. And in terms of me trying to imagine an organized solidarity, I'm not sure we necessarily want to imagine organized solidarity along secessionism off the coast, because we're not quite sure what that would mean politically in terms of how they would formulate and what state we're looking at.
Thank you, Natasha. We are almost at the end of our time. I had a question, but I don't know if there's enough time for you to respond to it. But are there any other questions, comments, quick final round, maybe? Otherwise,
I think the follow-up was from Yambura was just that her question was on solidarity of land, not secession.
yes.
Solidarity of land, analytically, of course, the land problems are very similar throughout the coast and take on the Waqf Commissioners Act was developed throughout the coast, and there were similar problems that were confronted. With Mombasa, particularly so because of the Hadrami presence and the links to Yemen. And of course, Eng Seng Ho's work on Graves of Tarim is excellent in discussing in terms of the context of Yemen. But if we think of it in terms of the context of East Africa, there's a paper that has been written on Anne Bang talking about the relationships that the Hadrami maintained through madrasas, etc., and Waqf endowments with. So it was far more entrenched in the case of Mombasa in particular. But it is very difficult to look back at the 16th, 17th centuries and claim this entrenchment only in the specific case of Mombasa, because there was a connection throughout. The intellectual connections which Anne Bang shows in her article between Zanzibar and Mombasa were inseparable. So when it comes to questions of land that arose from these kind of intellectual traditions and discussions of Waqf endowments, etc., again, these are inseparable, not just on the coast, they're inseparable from kind of movements to Sudan and Egypt. So the solidarities exist historically. Many of the grievances exist in these spaces that are very similar to each other. The only reason I talk of the MRC is because it is making claims around the questions of boundedness against the nation state.
Thanks. I'll ask the question. You don't have to respond to it, but thank you again for the fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. I had a quick question. I don't know if we have time. I was just wondering about, what is the infrastructure of this quoting? Because while he was speaking, I was thinking more, but that's more in an urban context, thinking of Parthacharyji's political society conceptualization. And there is a set of negotiation that happens between such squatting communities, at least in urban infrastructural context, where they're negotiating with state in different informal ways. And there are particular infrastructural material around which these negotiations take place, very precarious negotiations. Now, I understand this is a more of a peasant society where squatting in itself wouldn't demand that kind of, or wouldn't involve that kind of urban infrastructural negotiation, but I was still wondering what the material channels of such negotiations are, if there are any, in these squatting communities, both with the state and with the landed community, the older elite landed communities who are kind of glomming onto this discourse of secessionism.
I think that's the interesting aspect with the MRC, that there are no specific list of demands, if that's what you mean by the kind of, you know, there are no tokens of negotiation as such in the form of infrastructure, in making demands to the landed elite, in making demands to the state, and even in terms of representational politics, right? In terms of how the landed elite can represent the interests of Mombasa if they were to get a space in the state. Even that's not really there, because representational politics at this time don't exist in any kind of material form. And that has been part of the problem, right? That Mombasa has been excluded from the kind of representational politics of Kenya. And so they're at the very stages of even the landed elite is trying to become part of the state, an integral part of the state in order to benefit from the state. And those who are squatting on the land, the claims that they are making to the landed elite are almost that these are their protectors. As confused as that sounds, they're almost like they're protectors. They're representatives to the state. And when they refuse to represent these people to the state, they represent themselves by making claims to a colonial past and ideological institutions that are unavailable to the imagination of the nation state as it exists, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no real kind of outward claim that is being made that can be read into the superficial. But of course, inherent to these claims are the question of land and how land can be administered more justly. There's a question of democratic kind of involvement in government. There's the question of, water and electricity in many cases, right? So these questions are very much underneath it, but that's not what they're saying. So it would be wrong of me it is not this clear-cut kind of political society argument where there is a claim that is being made outright. And to me, that's even more interesting, that they're choosing to use this very obscure political language that's premised on ideology and long historical discourses in order to make their grievances apparent, rather than using the very question that the state is grabbing our land and stealing from us.
Thank you, Natasha. Sorry, we are completely out of time. I think a class is going to start here where I am. But again, thank you so much for sharing your work. There are a few questions in the chat. Maybe you can respond to them later if possible. But again, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And we'll see you next week when Mia, who's our PhD student, is going to present her work. Thanks.
And I'll be happy to share my email address in the chat with anyone, because I
Yes.
think, especially in terms of Professor Jeppi's comments and Yambura's comments, there's more material that can really elaborate, archival material that can elaborate some of the questions that I'm not able to get into with this talk.